At 4 in the morning, in the stillness of a narrow driveway tucked into the Hollywood Hills, a 2.5-ton Jeep Cherokee began to roll backward. There was no engine roar, no screeching tires, just the slow, silent movement of a machine heavy enough to crush anything in its path. A few seconds later, it pinned 27-year-old actor Anton Yelchin against the iron gate outside his own home. And then, everything stopped. What happened here? How could a young star, at the height of his career, die in a scenario that investigators described as almost mechanically impossible? Why did a vehicle supposedly parked in place suddenly drift down a slope? And the more haunting question, how long did Anton remain there alone, unheard, and unseen before anyone realized he was gone? This was not a car crash. It was not a reckless accident on a highway. It happened in the safest place anyone knows, their own driveway. Yet the very spot Anton walked across every day became the stage for one of Hollywood's most unsettling tragedies. Tonight, we will retrace the final hours of the Star Trek actor whose brilliance was extinguished far too soon. We will walk through those last steps, piece together the timeline investigators uncovered, and examine the mysterious mechanical flaw that claimed his life and led to a global recall of more than 1.4 million vehicles. Because the truth is this: Anton didn't die in a dramatic stunt or a wild night out. He died quietly, violently, and inexplicably within arm's reach of his front door. What really happened in those final moments? And what secrets were buried beneath the steel frame of that Jeep? Stay with us. The story you are about to hear is not just tragic, it is almost unbelievable. News of Anton Yelchin's death broke just after midday, on June 19, 2016. Within minutes, social media collapsed into disbelief. Headlines spread faster than investigators could confirm details. Star Trek actor dead at 27. Freak accident claims rising Hollywood star. Crushed by his own car. The phrasing felt surreal, almost careless, as if no headline could possibly capture the absurd cruelty of the situation. Friends and colleagues learned of his death the same way strangers did, through alerts on their phones. Zoe Saldana wrote that she was in tears. Unable to understand, Chris Pine was described as devastated. J. Abrams released a handwritten note calling Anton brilliant, kind, curious, and utterly irreplaceable. These weren't just polite Hollywood statements. Many of them had watched Anton grow up on set, transition from a shy, thoughtful young actor into a performer who carried entire films on his shoulders. Across the globe, fans compared timestamps of the breaking news, unable to comprehend that the man who once played heroes, prodigies, poets, and troubled souls could vanish in such an abrupt, senseless moment. Candlelight vigils appeared outside the studio gates. People left letters at the site of the accident, some even kneeling beside the sloping driveway as though trying to understand how geography itself could betray someone. Part of the shock came not just from his death, but from how he died. Hollywood is familiar with tragedy, overdoses, illness, high-speed crashes, scandals, but this was something else entirely. A freak mechanical failure? A catastrophic design flaw? A momentary misstep with fatal consequences? The early police statements only deepened the confusion. There were no signs of foul play, no collision, no alcohol, no drugs. Just Anton. And a parked vehicle that was not where it was supposed to be. And beneath all the public mourning, another emotion simmered: unease. Because if a car could crush a healthy 27-year-old without warning, what did that mean for the millions of identical vehicles still being driven on American roads? Within 24 hours, the story had shifted. This was no longer solely about the tragic death of a beloved actor. This was about responsibility, liability, engineering failures, corporate silence, and a question that would haunt investigators and fans alike. Was Anton's death an unforeseeable accident, or the direct result of a known mechanical danger that should never have been allowed to reach his driveway? As Hollywood mourned, the world braced for answers that would prove more disturbing than anyone expected. Long before his name appeared on studio marquees, Anton Yelchin was simply a quiet child with a curious mind. Born in Leningrad to two renowned figure skaters, His earliest years were shaped by uncertainty. His family fled the collapsing Soviet Union when he was just 6 months old, leaving behind a country they could no longer trust. They arrived in the United States with barely anything, no money, no language, no guarantees. What they did bring was hope, a fierce love for their son, and a belief that America would give him the chance to be whoever he wanted to become. In Los Angeles, that chance arrived sooner than anyone expected. Anton displayed a remarkable sensitivity, able to express emotions far beyond his age. Casting agents noticed. Directors noticed. He wasn't the loudest child in the room, but he had the rare ability to make silence speak. By the time he was 10, he had already appeared in films and television shows, often playing children who seemed wise beyond their years. As he grew older, Anton carved out a reputation as one of Hollywood's most gifted young actors. He chose roles carefully, gravitating toward characters who were damaged, misunderstood, searching. He played the troubled teenager in Alpha Dog, the musical Prodigy in Fiddler on the Roof, the genius engineer Pavel Chekhov in the rebooted Star Trek franchise. Each performance revealed a different facet of his inner world, gentle, introspective, deeply human. But success never hardened him. On set, he was known as the quiet soul, always scribbling in a notebook, reading philosophy between takes, experimenting with music after long shooting days. He questioned everything, absorbed everything, lived with an intensity that bordered on fragile. People described him as an old soul trapped in the body of a young actor, someone who carried both innocence and melancholy. Behind his talent, though, lived a constant pressure. Hollywood embraced him, but it also consumed him. Every new role required him to transform, disappear, rebuild. Every audition reminded him that careers in this industry could vanish overnight, and his private nature made the spotlight feel heavier than most people realized. He loved storytelling but hated fame. He loved acting but feared the machinery around it. He once confessed to a friend that he worried whether he was good enough to justify the opportunities he'd been given. Yet, even under the weight of his own doubts, Anton kept rising. By 27, he had built a filmography actors twice his age would envy. Like Crazy, Fright Night, Only Lovers Left Alive. Projects that proved he could shift seamlessly from blockbuster spectacle to intimate indie drama. Directors trusted him. Fellow actors adored him. Critics praised him as the next generation's brightest star. But the more his professional world expanded, the smaller his personal world became. He lived alone in a modest home, tucked away on a sloping street. He drove himself to auditions, handled his own errands, and avoided the Hollywood party circuit almost entirely. Fame had made him visible, but not connected. And in that solitude, his brilliance often looked indistinguishable from vulnerability. The driveway where his life would end held no symbolic meaning back then. It was just a path. A place he crossed every morning with a coffee cup in hand, a place he returned to after long nights on set. A place that felt safe in a life where very little ever did. No one could have predicted that this quiet, unassuming stretch of concrete would one day become the focal point of a global investigation or the final frame of a story that had only begun to unfold. Anton Yelchin never spiraled into scandal. He never battled addiction, never feuded publicly, never became tabloid prey. Yet beneath the surface of his calm, gentle persona was a young man quietly wrestling with a world that often asked more of him than he could safely give. His struggles weren't loud. They were internal quiet storms hidden behind the softness of his voice and the sincerity of his smile. As his career accelerated, so did the emotional weight tethered to it. Hollywood is a place that rewards visibility but punishes vulnerability. Anton was the kind of artist who felt everything deeply, a trait that made him exceptional on screen but fragile off it. His parents later described periods where he seemed overwhelmed by the speed of his own success. He took on multiple roles back to back, barely resting, always fearing that if he slowed down even for a moment, he might lose the momentum he had fought so hard to build. Directors admired his intensity, but that intensity often translated into sleepless nights, obsessive preparation, and long stretches of solitude. He poured himself into characters until he nearly dissolved into them. After filming ended, he sometimes struggled to reassemble himself. Friends recalled him going silent for days, disappearing into films, books, or music, not out of arrogance, but because he didn't know how else to reset his mind. He also carried a private fear, the fear of disappointing others. As the only child of immigrant parents who had sacrificed their entire lives for his future, Anton felt an unspoken responsibility to make their journey worthwhile. His success was not just his own. It was proof that everything his parents endured, the uprooting, the uncertainty, the struggle to adapt, had led somewhere meaningful. That kind of pressure is invisible to the world, yet crushing in the quiet of a young actor's heart. Physically, the demands of Hollywood wore him down. Filming multiple projects a year meant unpredictable schedules, long nights, and grueling stunts. He often drove home exhausted, sometimes at dawn, occasionally battling waves of anxiety about whether he had given enough on set or worse, whether he had failed. Then there was the Jeep. Anton had complained to friends that the gear shifter in his Jeep Cherokee felt odd, difficult to read, strangely ambiguous. At a glance, it looked modern, sleek, electronic, futuristic, but the shift-by-wire system was notoriously confusing. Many drivers reported that they believed their vehicle was safely in park, only to discover it was actually in neutral, capable of rolling freely. The design flaw wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Millions of vehicles would later be recalled for it, but in the weeks leading up to his death, Anton had no way of knowing he was driving a machine that might betray him. As his work commitments piled up, his time at home grew more infrequent. He rehearsed for a new project, attended meetings, prepared for international promotions. Sometimes he returned to his quiet hillside house just long enough to sleep, feed his pets, or pick up something he had forgotten. His driveway, angled just slightly downward, had never demanded his attention. It was simply part of the landscape, unchanging, familiar, harmless. And yet, this period of escalating pressure, fragmented rest, and lonely routines created a perfect storm. Not because Anton was unraveling in a traditional sense, but because he was stretched thin, fatigued, and navigating life largely on his own. He had no assistant living with him, no manager watching over his schedule day to day, no entourage to track his movements or check on him at odd hours. In a city where isolation can swallow even the brightest stars, Anton lived quietly, independently, perhaps too independently. His gentle nature kept him away from chaos. But it also meant that when something felt off, whether in his life, his mind, or his vehicle, he tended to internalize it rather than seek help. The tragedy would not arise from scandal, addiction, or self-destructive choices. It would emerge from the intersection of design flaws, exhaustion, solitude, and terrible timing factors that, in the moment, seemed unrelated, but would converge with deadly precision. In the weeks before his death, nothing in Anton's behavior suggested he was in danger. No final confessions, no alarming statements, no erratic decisions. Just a young artist juggling too many responsibilities. Returning to a quiet home on a hill, unaware that the shadows gathering around him were mechanical, not emotional. And hidden within those shadows was the silent threat waiting on his driveway, one that would reveal itself in the most devastating way imaginable. In the final weeks of his life, Anton Yelchin seemed to be standing at a quiet crossroads, one marked not by crisis or chaos, but by an overwhelming sense of transition. He had just completed several demanding projects and was preparing for more. His career was blossoming in a direction he had always hoped for. More independent films, more character pieces, more chances to explore the human mind on screen. To friends, he appeared calm yet preoccupied. Not troubled, just busy. Stretched thin between commitments, auditions, and meetings. He was building towards something. And yet, like many artists, on the verge of the next chapter, he moved through these days with a kind of distracted focus, the sort that hides exhaustion behind determination. He spent time with his parents, who lived only a short drive away. They adored him, and he adored them back. Their relationship was tight-knit, rooted in shared sacrifice and unconditional love. When they saw him in these final days, nothing seemed off. He was smiling. He was making plans. He was talking about upcoming roles. But he was also tired more than usual. He had been rehearsing for a new film project, a role that required deep emotional preparation. His schedule was erratic, bouncing between early morning calls and late-night conversations with directors. He often drove back to his home near Studio City after dark, parking his Jeep Cherokee at the top of his angled driveway, sometimes grabbing mail, sometimes stepping inside for only a moment before heading out again. He had told friends before that the Jeep felt strange. The gear shifter didn't click into place like the older cars he was used to. It was electronic, smooth, silent, ambiguous. Several people remembered him mentioning that it was hard to tell if the vehicle was actually in park. He wasn't the only one confused. Complaints had quietly piled up across the country, but at that moment, neither he nor anyone around him knew the magnitude of the problem. In the final days, Anton seemed creatively energized. He hosted friends for small gatherings, showed them new photography projects, played songs he loved, and recommended books with his usual enthusiasm. His home felt alive in those moments, filled with laughter, art, and the gentle warmth of someone who cherished connection. Nothing in these days hinted at tragedy. On the night before his death, he exchanged messages with friends about plans later in the week. He confirmed a meeting scheduled for the next morning, a rehearsal call at the studio. He said goodnight. He went home. His lights turned on briefly, then off. Sometime after midnight, the world outside his house fell silent. The hills grew darker, the streets emptied, the temperature cooled. It was the kind of California night that felt still and heavy, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Inside his home, Anton was entirely unaware that this ordinary night would be the last one he ever lived. There was no foreshadowing, no warning signs, no ominous message or distressed phone call. Just a quiet evening, a familiar driveway, and a vehicle with a flaw so severe it would later trigger one of the largest recalls in Jeep's history. In those final days, Anton stood on the edge of a new creative chapter, unaware that his life was about to intersect with a mechanical danger he did not create and could not possibly predict. The stage was set. The house was quiet. The driveway waited in the darkness. Within hours, it would become the center of one of Hollywood's most devastating tragedies. The last 24 hours of Anton Yelchin's life began without fanfare. No sense of dread, no hint of the violent stillness waiting at the edge of the next sunrise. It was June 19th, a quiet Sunday in Los Angeles, the kind of day where the city seems to exhale traffic lighter, the heat softer, the hills washed in pale gold. Anton spent part of the afternoon at home, reviewing material for an upcoming project. Friends would later say that he seemed unusually focused that weekend. Motivated, maybe even inspired. He exchanged messages, confirming he would attend an early morning rehearsal. Nothing dramatic. Nothing emotional. Just the usual rhythm of a working actor preparing for another demanding week. As evening approached, he moved around his modest home the way he always did, checking emails, watering plants, turning his music on low. His neighbors saw nothing unusual. His house, tucked into the quiet bends of the Studio City hills, felt almost insulated from the world, wrapped in silence as night settled in. Sometime before midnight, Anton stepped outside, maybe to grab something from the mailbox, maybe to organize items in his Jeep Cherokee, maybe simply because he liked the calm of the night. Security cameras from nearby homes would later confirm only fragments, a figure moving briefly, headlights flickering, the soft hum of an engine, the Jeep rolling forward and then stopping. No one could hear what he said, or if he said anything at all. The world around him remained muted, as if the night were preserving a secret. Just after that, sometime between 1 and 2 in the morning, he likely went back inside. The house was dark, the street empty. The temperature dropped a few degrees, the air turning crisp in the canyon. Hours passed. Then came the moment that would change everything. Before sunrise, Anton walked outside again. He planned to leave early for his rehearsal. It was still dim light enough to see shapes, not enough to see danger. He walked toward his Jeep, parked as he had done countless times before on the steep incline of his driveway. What happened next would later be reconstructed through evidence, physics, and the haunting logic of a mechanical flaw. Anton positioned himself between the rear of the Jeep and the security gate, likely to open it by hand before driving out. The gear selector in his model of Cherokee was electronic, not mechanical. It did not move into fixed positions. Drivers across the country had already filed complaints, insisting they could not tell whether their gear was truly in park. Thousands reported that the vehicle rolled even when they believed it was secure. What is known is that Anton's Jeep was not in park. The SUV began to move. Slowly at first. Quietly. The kind of slow roll a person might not notice until too late. On that steep driveway, gravity did the rest, turning a silent drift into a crushing force. By the time Anton realized what was happening, there was no space, no leverage, no time. The Jeep pinned him against the metal gate, trapping him between a 2-ton vehicle and an object that could not brake, could not move, could not give him room to breathe. There were no screams heard by neighbors. No thud loud enough to wake anyone. No crash, no skid, no sound that signaled catastrophe. It was violence without noise. A fatal moment swallowed by the stillness of early morning. The hours that followed were a void. At his rehearsal location, friends waited. And waited. And waited. Anton was never late. Not once. They called. No answer. They called again. Still nothing. By mid-morning, the unease became dread. Friends drove to his home, pulling up the narrow street leading to his driveway. As they stepped out of the car, something felt wrong. His own vehicle, not where it should be. The gate slightly ajar, the stillness too heavy. Then they saw him, pinned, motionless, caught in a position no one should ever die in. A life ended not by recklessness or self-destruction, but by the brutal convergence of physics and flawed engineering. Panic erupted. Calls to emergency services. Shouts. Desperation that came far too late. When paramedics arrived, there was nothing to save. Anton had been gone for hours. The sun climbed higher in the morning sky, shining on a driveway that already looked like a crime scene, though it was no crime, at least not in the traditional sense. Within minutes, the news began spreading quietly among friends. Within hours, the world would learn that one of Hollywood's brightest young talents had died in an accident so surreal, so avoidable, that people struggled to accept it was real. Photographs of the scene circulated. His Jeep, still running, still in neutral, still angled on the steep incline that had turned it into a lethal force. Investigators noted the defect immediately. They had seen cases like this before, many. But now, the victim was not anonymous. He was international, beloved, a star whose rising trajectory had already begun reshaping Hollywood. And just like that, a driveway became the last chapter of a life that had promised so much more. The sun rose. The street filled with emergency vehicles. The home, once a sanctuary for silence and creativity, stood as a reminder of how fragile a single moment can be. By the time the world woke up, Anton Yelchin was already gone. And yet the questions were only beginning. News of Anton Yelchin's death traveled across Los Angeles with a kind of stunned disbelief. Within an hour, studio executives were calling one another in shock. Directors he had worked with were texting their teams, convinced there must be some mistake. Online, fans who had woken to an ordinary morning were suddenly asking the same question, over and over. How does someone so young, so gentle, so careful, die in a driveway? The details were incomprehensible, the imagery unbearable, and the explanation, at least at first, did not seem real. Hollywood has seen tragedy before, but nothing quite like this. Not a car crash, not an overdose, not an illness. This was something stranger. A mechanical failure that behaved almost like a silent predator, lurking beneath the surface of a normal life. Within hours, investigators identified the key factor. Anton's Jeep Grand Cherokee was part of a massive recall involving a defective electronic gear shifter. The design was so counterintuitive, so misleading, that thousands of drivers had complained about vehicles rolling unexpectedly, even when they believed they had shifted into park. More than 1 million vehicles were affected. Reports had been filed, warnings issued, software patches proposed. But on June 19, 2016, none of that mattered, not soon enough, not for Anton. As investigators documented the scene, they found the Jeep's engine still running, its gear set in neutral. Evidence made one thing clear. He had not placed himself in harm's way. The vehicle had betrayed him. Suddenly, the tragedy no longer felt like an accident, it felt systemic. In the days that followed, public outrage surged. News anchors spoke with incredulity. Safety experts were brought onto talk shows. Auto journalists pulled up years of complaints that now seemed prophetic. The U.S. government opened formal inquiries into the shifter defect. Pressure mounted on Fiat Chrysler Automobiles, the manufacturer, to answer the question the world kept asking. If this flaw was known, why was it still allowed on the road? At the center of this storm were two devastated parents, Viktor and Irina Yelchin, who had built their lives around protecting their son from an unstable Soviet Union, from the pressures of fame, from every hardship life could throw at him now, found themselves facing a nightmare that defied every instinct they had devoted their lives to. Their grief was not quiet. It was raw, open, and defiant. They filed a lawsuit, not for money, but to force transparency. They wanted the truth behind the defect, the testing protocols, the timeline of warnings. They wanted accountability, an acknowledgement that this was not random fate. Irina once said in an interview, "We just don't want this to happen to anyone else." The lawsuit uncovered documents showing that the confusing gear system had been under scrutiny for years. Complaints had piled up. A government investigation had already been launched months before Anton's death. Fiat Chrysler had announced a recall just weeks earlier, but many owners, including Anton, had not yet received repairs. The revelation ignited public anger further. It also fueled darker theories. Online forums buzzed with speculation. Was the recall timed too late? Did automakers underestimate the danger? Could earlier action have prevented this loss? No conspiracy theories claimed foul play in the traditional sense. Not murder, not sabotage, not hidden enemies. Instead, the suspicion pointed towards something far more mundane and far more devastating: negligence, design failure, corporate delay. The kind of tragedy that feels almost crueler because it is so preventable. Hollywood responded in waves. Co-stars from the Star Trek franchise posted tributes, each revealing their own stories of Anton's kindness, intellect, and disarming humility. Fans gathered outside his home, leaving flowers, letters, drawings of Chekhov. His iconic character sometimes accompanied by the words, "We'll miss you at the helm." But beneath the mourning was a persistent sense of confusion. People kept asking how such a brilliant life could be extinguished, not by chaos, but by an everyday object. Something everyone uses, something everyone trusts. And yet, even with investigations completed and accountability pursued, one truth lingered. No explanation could ever reconcile how a defective gear shifter, a simple design flaw, took the life of a young actor who had survived immigration, fame, pressure, and the unpredictable tides of Hollywood. That disconnect, that cosmic unfairness, is what kept the tragedy alive in public consciousness. It is why documentaries continued to revisit the case, why legal experts still reference it, why automotive schools teach it. Because Anton's death was not just a loss, it was a warning, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful forces of destruction are not dramatic, not cinematic, not fueled by scandal or excess. Sometimes they are quiet, invisible, hidden inside machines we trust with our lives. As the world processed the shock, his parents continued to fight, not just for their son, but for every driver who might unknowingly face the same danger. They became advocates, storytellers, guardians of the truth behind his final hours. But even with answers, Nothing filled the absence he left behind. The studio he was meant to report to that morning held a moment of silence. Directors who had planned future films with him rewrote scripts or shelved projects entirely. And friends who had expected to see him at lunch that week sat at tables that now felt unbearably empty. Anton Yelchin had been more than a rising star. He was a reminder that gentleness still had a place in Hollywood. And losing him in such a senseless way forced the world to confront how fragile even the brightest lives can be. The controversy slowly cooled. The investigations eventually closed. The lawsuits reached settlements. But the questions, those weightless, unanswerable questions, never truly disappeared. How could this happen? Why him? Why this way? In the end, the world was left with an ache that felt both intimate and universal. An ache that said, this was not how his story was meant to end. In the years since Anton Yelchin's passing, the world has struggled to reconcile the brutality of his final moments with the beauty of the life he left behind. His name is now spoken with a kind of reverence, a softness, almost as though people instinctively lower their voices out of respect for the promise that was stolen too soon. His body of work, though brief, has grown brighter with time. Audiences revisit his films not just to grieve, but to rediscover the rare clarity he brought to every role. He had that unteachable gift of disappearing into characters, shy teenagers, tormented artists, bold explorers, outsiders searching for belonging. Each performance now feels like its own time capsule, a window into a mind that understood vulnerability better than most adults twice his age. Hollywood often forgets quickly, but not this time. Directors still reference him in interviews, speaking of his intuition, his curiosity, his almost monastic dedication to craft. Co-stars describe him as the soul of every set, a quiet presence who made the room feel steadier simply by being in it. Friends remember a young man who never used fame as a shield, who still attended small concerts, still carried a camera everywhere, still made time for people who expected nothing from him. And then there are his parents, Victor and Irina, who transformed their grief into something powerful, something purposeful. They established the Anton Yelchin Foundation, dedicated to helping young artists who face physical or financial challenges. They also launched a photography exhibit featuring Anton's own work, revealing a side of him the world had never seen. Raw images of strangers, buildings, streets, and fleeting moments that reflected a quiet sensitivity beneath everything he did. Through them, Anton's spirit continues to move, to reach, to inspire. His death sparked reforms as well. Automakers were forced to confront the dangers of confusing gear systems, leading to clearer designs, safer mechanisms, and improved recall communication. In a way, one tragically ironic Anton saved lives. His story became a cautionary tale that pushed an industry to change. Yet for all the progress, all the tributes, all the lessons, there remains an ache that no justice, no legacy, no memorial can erase. Because what the world truly lost was not just a gifted actor, but a human being in the middle of becoming someone whose best work likely still lay ahead of him. Someone whose curiosity could have carried him into directing, writing, music, photojournalism. Someone who, by every account, lived gently in a world that is not always gentle back. And when we return to those final hours when we imagine the quiet driveway, the paused plans, the untouched rehearsal script waiting inside his house, we are reminded of the fragility that connects all of us. How quickly the everyday can turn irreversible. How thin the line is between ordinary life and a moment that changes everything. Anton once said in an interview that he didn't care about being famous. He cared about understanding people, what frightened them, what moved them, what made them human. In the end, perhaps that is why his story resonates so deeply. His final hours were an unthinkable tragedy, but the life preceding them was filled with authenticity, empathy, and art. And maybe that's the message his story leaves us with. That no matter how unpredictable the world is, our kindness matters. Our curiosity matters. The way we love, work, dream, and connect, those things matter. For Anton Yelchin, The final chapter came far too soon. But the chapters he wrote while he was here continue to echo across screens, across hearts, across the people he touched without ever knowing it. He is gone, but what he left behind is still alive. A legacy not built on longevity, but on depth, not on spectacle, but on sincerity. In remembering his last moments, we are invited to look more closely at our own lives, to recognize the beauty in the ordinary, the weight of the choices we take for granted, and the urgency of loving well while we still have the time. And when the screen finally fades to black, we are left with a single, quiet truth. Some stars burn briefly, but they illuminate everything around them.